Hi, boys and girls. It's good to be back with you again. And I just want to begin today by saying thank you so much for the cards and for singing to me Sunday. I sat down after church and Annalise helped me, and we looked at all of the cards that you made for me for my birthday. And I had a very happy birthday. So thank you so much. And I love all of you. And today we're going to look at a book that tells the story of Abraham. And I want to read a few pages to you, and I'll show you the pictures today. Sometimes the pictures I'll have here in a book with me, and you can maybe see the pictures. Sometimes there won't be any pictures at all. And that's okay too, because we can imagine things in our minds. And sometimes the best pictures we can have are when we think of things with our minds. And then sometimes I'll be able to put the pictures on the screen for you. And so we'll do it different ways on different days, depending on how what book I'm going to use. But today, I'm using the same book I used last week because I like the way this tells the story of Abraham. This is called The Biggest Story. And some of your moms and dads may have this. And if so, you can get the book and follow along with me as I read the story of Abraham. Because we're going to be talking about Abraham this coming Sunday, and so I want to read that story today. We won't always read the story that we're going to talk about Sunday, but today we will. Abraham's a very important figure in the Bible, and God chose Abraham to be his instrument for redeeming the whole world. And so Abraham was the one that God picked. And let's read about this story, and I'll show you the pictures as we move along, okay? But let's begin today by reading the story of Abraham. Not too long after the whole story with Noah that we saw last week, God called a man named Abraham to leave his home and go to a new country. Actually, his name was Abram at this point, but everyone remembers him as Abraham. When God called Abraham, he made a lot of big promises. He promised to bless Abraham and to bless everyone who blessed Abraham. He promised to curse everyone who cursed Abraham. And he promised Abraham a land and a child. God promised that Abraham would be the father of a great nation and that all the nations of the world would be blessed through him. Pretty much all the blessings that God wanted to give Adam and Eve, he promised to Abraham. And the best part, this time God was going to do everything himself to make sure that Abraham got the blessings. You might think that God wanted to bless Abraham because he was such a swell guy. But Abraham didn't know God at all when God called him. And even after he got the call and all these promises, Abraham could still be a liar and a bit of a scaredy cat. Abraham's life had a lot of ups and downs, but he had two things going for him. The only two things, it turns out, that really matter. God's promise to bless him and Abraham's belief in God's promise. That's all Abraham had, which was a good deal because that was all he needed. And here you can see the picture of Abraham, it looks like on a horse, riding through a valley there. And these, of course, pictures are make-believe. At times, it looked as if God wasn't going to keep his promises to Abraham. For one thing, it was about 100 years before Abraham and his wife Sarah, who used to be called Sarai, had a baby named Isaac, who thankfully was always called Isaac. And then, when the baby grew into a boy, God told Abraham to kill him. That must have seemed like a not-so-funny way to make a great nation out of Abraham. But Abraham listened to God anyway, and at the last second, God gave Abraham a ram to sacrifice instead of his beloved son. It was God's way of saying, I'll take care of the rescuing. Just trust me. God had commanded Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice instead of the animal that they would normally use. But God provided an animal for Abraham to sacrifice instead. And that was teaching a very important lesson. God himself provides the sacrifice that we need to please him. Eventually, Isaac grew up and got married and had some kids of his own, twins to be exact, Esau and Jacob. And God picked Jacob to get the blessing even though he was the younger brother and wasn't supposed to get the blessing. But God is God, so he gets to pick. Jacob had 12 sons, and this time it was the fourth son, Judah, who wound up with the best blessing. Jacob told Judah that a lion of a leader would come from his family. And here you can see some pictures. You've got Jacob and Esau, the twins, and then the 12 sons that later came on. God promised great blessings, but this was not so great a people. Isaac was sort of a weakling. Jacob was a selfish trickster. And Judah did such dumb stuff, we don't even want to talk about it. And yet again and again, God kept his promises all the same. He blessed the whole lot of them, despite themselves. Maybe the snake crusher would still come from the gnarled branches of the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob family tree. And here's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here's a sort of a silly picture of a tree. When we talk about our moms and dads and our parents and our grandparents, we call that a family tree. And God's promised to bless the world through the family of Abraham. And what God's teaching us, boys and girls, is something very, very important. We saw with Adam that he fell into sin. We saw with Noah, even though God blessed Noah, and Noah was a godly man, that after the flood, do you remember Noah sinned? And he did something that wasn't good and wasn't right. And now we see Abraham, and God promised to bless Abraham. But God didn't put any conditions on this blessing. He didn't tell Abraham that he had to be good. He didn't tell Abraham anything. And all Abraham did was believe God and trust God. And that pleased God very much. God made these conditions because all of us are sinful. And God, if he's going to bless us, he just has to promise to bless us based on his goodness, not on any goodness in us, because none of us are good. And so the lesson we learn from Abraham, one of them is that we need to trust God the way that Abraham did. Abraham and Noah were both considered righteous men, not because they were so good in themselves and not because they never did anything bad or wrong, but first and foremost because they trusted God. And because they trusted him, they tried very hard to obey his word. God always wants us to believe his promises. God always wants us to trust him. And I hope, boys and girls, more than anything else, you will learn to trust God and take him at his word. He never breaks his promises. He never lies to us. And God is always able to make his promises come true. And in the life of Abraham, as we're going to see this Sunday, God did that even when it didn't look like at all that his promises could be kept, because Abraham was very, very old before he had any children. He was 100 years old. So the lesson to us is that God keeps his promises, and that God's promise is to bless the entire world through Abraham. Now, moms and dads, I want you to talk with your boys and girls about a couple of things. Number one, how is it that God was going to bless the whole world through this one family? Who is it that was to come, who was in the line of Abraham, that would wind up being the blessing for the whole world? That's very, very important for us to understand. And the second thing is, why was Abraham so pleasing to God? What did Abraham do? Look at Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6 and discuss that with your moms and dads, boys and girls, and see what it is that Abraham did that pleased God. And should we do the same thing? Okay? Boys and girls, I love you. Thank you again for my cards, and thank you for singing to me. And I look forward to seeing you soon this Sunday, and we'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.